We'll begin today with a reading from one of the aphorisms in Book 9 of Beyond Good and Evil, entitled, What is Noble? Quote, corruption. As the indication that anarchy threatens to break out among the instincts, and that the foundation of the emotions, called life, is convulsed, is something radically different according to the organization in which it manifests itself. When, for instance, an aristocracy like that of France at the beginning of the Revolution flung away its privileges with sublime disgust and sacrificed itself to an excess of its moral sentiments, it was corruption. It was really only the closing act of the corruption which had existed for centuries, by virtue of which that aristocracy had abdicated step by step its lordly prerogatives and lowered itself to a function of royalty. In the end, even to its decoration and parade dress. The essential thing, however, in a good and healthy aristocracy is that it should not regard itself as a function either of the kingship or the commonwealth, but as the significance and highest justification thereof, that it should therefore accept with a good conscience the sacrifice of a legion of individuals who, for its sake, must be suppressed and reduced to imperfect men, to slaves and instruments. Its fundamental belief must be precisely that society is not allowed to exist for its own sake, but only as a foundation and scaffolding, by means of which a select class of beings may be able to elevate themselves to their higher duties, and in general to a higher existence. Like those sun-seeking climbing plants in Java, they are called Sipo Matador, which encircle an oak so long and so often with their arms, until at last, high above it, but supported by it, they can unfold their tops in the open light and exhibit their happiness. End quote. That was Helen Zimmerman's translation of a passage in Nietzsche that is an absolute stick of dynamite thrown down right into the hole of our little sailing ship of liberal idealism. It attacks everything that we as modern people hold as our values. It attacks the left-wing sense of the essential equality of mankind, both in its possibility and the sense that there ought to be such an equality realized among men. Here Nietzsche says that some need to be made into instruments for the sake of others. But in so doing, he also attacks the more right-leaning expression of liberalism, perhaps best exemplified in the idea of individuals, quote-unquote, living for their own sake rather than being dominated and made to live for the sake of another. That was Ayn Rand's cardinal sin, to live for the sake of everyone else. And the mainstream forms of conservatism in liberal society, whatever their broader differences with Rand may sometimes be, are primarily concerned with concepts such as freedom and liberty and the right to be personally responsible for one's own fate. In a word, individualism. This passage decries the breakdown of an older order, which is not based on such ideas. This old order was not only hierarchical, but a system of castes in which some lives are more important than others, in which some were used for the sake of others, and explicitly so. And thus it knew nothing of our ideas of either equality or individualism. The breakdown of this order, Nietzsche believes, begins when it gives into moral sentimentality, when it gives into such ideas as those which colored the French Revolution, which he references in this passage, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Pardon my French, as always. Now, underlying this passage, there's an inference you can draw that it's culture, which is prior to the social order in some sense, in Nietzsche's view. Culture being made up of the shared agreements that the collective holds in regard to its values, or to be more specific, its particular answers to the universal challenges confronting mankind, such as how to live, how to die, what the family should be, and so on and so forth. And so for Nietzsche, it's a shift in values which has worn away the foundations of this former social order that he describes in broad outline. And from our studies so far, we know what this is. or we know what the broader story that Nietzsche tells about this change in values. It's the triumph of the slave morality over the master morality, or to put it in other terms, the victory of Christianity over the Western psyche and the death of the Dionysian pagan religious feeling. The old order, having emerged and been justified by this master morality and the pagan religious ideas, in the course of history eventually withers and dies from the revaluation of values that occurs. And it may not wither and die all at once when we look at the historical record, but it's like a once verdant field that just endures, an ever worsening drought, right? We see, the soil crack and, dry out, even as some yellowing, old, dying grass still clings to life in some patches, right? It doesn't die all at once. But if this climate continues, eventually such a verdant field is destined to become a desert, and all the remaining life will eventually die out. And that's Nietzsche's picture of what happens to the master morality, right? In our society, we kept aspects of this old order intact, even as the Christian revaluation was well underway. Even after it was, in some sense, completed, there were still aspects of pagan religious feeling, or the master morality, or the Dionysian, or whatever you want to call it. But with the old beliefs now completely dead, the dissolution of the social order based on them is now at hand, and Nietzsche sees this anarchical dissolution of the old order to be this grave danger facing us, and ultimately he fears it will lead to the death of society as we know it. Nietzsche does not always sound the same tenor in his political opinions, and we'll certainly see that when we eventually cover early period and middle period Nietzsche and his views on politics or political philosophy. But Nietzsche is nevertheless an arch reactionary in this passage, as he is at most. It's sort of the tone he sounds throughout the last book of Beyond Good and Evil. And so we can consider this passage in this particular framing just because it is such an uncompromising assertion of aristocratic radicalism. It's, I think, important to cover this here. That's what aristocratic radicalism is, what the Danish philosopher Georg Brandes would call Nietzsche's philosophy. And this characterization of his political philosophy, Nietzsche himself famously or infamously said in a letter to Brandes to be the best framing he'd ever heard of his own ideas. And so, while that description, aristocratic radicalism, doesn't come from Nietzsche himself, he gave it his stamp of approval. And so we must honestly say that this should guide how we interpret his philosophy and its political implications, because Nietzsche did actually describe, or rather he endorsed, this description of what his political philosophy is aimed at. And this passage is exemplary in capturing it, even among the very many, many reactionary passages that we can find in Nietzsche's canon. This is one of the most extreme. And so that's why I wanted to open with it. I mean, throughout the season, we will explore the various dimensions of Nietzsche's thought on politics. Even if you find yourself in one of the camps that Nietzsche often attacks, I think much of it will be useful for anyone studying political philosophy. If you're a liberal, Democrat, a socialist, an anarchist, or Christian conservative, or whatever. There's not only something very useful in knowing the strongest criticisms of the ideas that we hold. Nietzsche writes, after all, it's not a matter of having courage of conviction. It's much better to have courage for an attack on your convictions. But Nietzsche, also prospectively skilled as he is, often inhabits some of these views that he attacks, and sometimes he provides good arguments for political ideas that he doesn't personally hold. So, nevertheless, we begin here with this clear demand, speaking directly from Nietzsche's instincts, which stands before our 21st century minds like an immovable mountain. Whatever ideas he may have entertained before his work after the period of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, this is where he ends up, right? A brilliant mind like Nietzsche's wrestled with these ideas over and over again for the better part of 2 decades, but in the end, and quite commensurate with the direction of his other ideas, he comes to this position of uncompromising elitism in the political sense. It is for the sake of a higher class of being that every society exists in this view. The metaphor he uses is the Sipo Matador vine. I'm going to read a description of this organism and how it behaves and propagates itself within its native habitat. Nietzsche says it's from Java, and I've seen different translations have Nietzsche attributed to different places. I don't know. What matters is that in reality, its native habitat is the Brazilian rainforest. Maybe there are some species that live in Java as well. But I found this description online, and it was unfortunately unattributed. This, what they were quoting, they put it in quotes. I assume it's from an encyclopedia somewhere, judging by the tone. But it was, it's like a Christian website that cited it. And the point is, I found a lot of descriptions of how the Sipo Matador vine operates, but I didn't find another one that offered better prose in its account. So even though I don't have an attribution for you, I'm just going to read this quote I found online because it's so good. Quote, "Its stem is at first so exceedingly tender that it has no natural support in itself. It entwines and creeps along the ground until it reaches some lofty, vigorous tree. Then its mode of growth is most peculiar. It lays hold of it with a clinging grasp and spreads itself like a flattened bark-like stem over one side of the trunk, cleaving to it with the greatest tenacity. From both the edges of this bark it sends out very delicate arm-like tendrils, exactly opposite to each other. They grow on until they meet, encircling the tree, around which they become a solid ligature never to be removed. These arms are sent forth at regular intervals as the murderer mounts upwards, until the trunk of its supporter is clasped by numberless inflexible rings. These rings grow larger and clasp tighter as the parasite ascends. Up it climbs 100 feet, 150, 180. At last it mounts to the very top, and then, as in triumph, forms a vast flowering head above all the surrounding forest, opens its blossoms to the sun, ripens its seeds, and scatters them over the soil below. The supporter, by this time, is strangled and dead, and the strange spectacle remains of the strangler clasping in its arms the lifeless and decaying body of its victim, in which wood-boring beetles have already commenced their operations. It soon crumbles in rapid decay, and the parasite which destroyed it, having flowered, fruited, and continued its kind, falls to the ground, a shapeless mass, involved in one common ruin with its supporter." End quote. So that's Nietzsche's metaphor. This is the nobility. In the old social order, it was for their own sake that society existed. I mean, it's downright parasitical. It's unashamedly parasitical, right? And so that's Nietzsche's idea that all the great individuals emerged within that nobility. They produced the culture of that society, and all the plebeians, you might say, labored and sacrificed and gave up their own vitality for these great people so that they could unfold this vibrant crown of their culture, art, the glory of great deeds, and so on. And so Nietzsche's elitism is a respect for that old social order and his acknowledgement that the system of parasitic oppression ends with the collapse of the entire thing. It's such a wonderful metaphor because it even speaks to his anti-self-preservation sort of instinct, right? And so what could be the argument for this elitism? Let's state the case as strongly as we can and try and cohabit with the perspective of Nietzsche's. What is the fruit that finally drops for the harvest, which grows out of the soil of a culture, say Germany, right? For Nietzsche, it is the fruit we should consider and not the plant as such. The bounty of the harvest is what concerns the farmer. That's what has value. Separate the wheat from the chaff and so on. Another way of putting this question is, what is the goal of society? What, therefore, is the goal of politics, right? For Nietzsche, the fruit, let's take, for example, a country such as his native Germany. The fruit that we harvest is Goethe, Beethoven, Schopenhauer, Schiller, Mozart, Friedrich II, right? It's great individuals that is the harvest of a society. And that, as we explored last season, is what makes civilization as a project all worth it. After all, we've removed ourselves from blind nature. We've cultivated our minds to the point where we've been able to reflect upon existential horrors that no other animal species, to our knowledge anyway, really has any awareness of. And so we've imposed, by means of collective punishment, rules upon ourselves and have constrained our instincts. For what purpose is all this? Why have we taken the horrific trade-off of consciousness and conscious awareness in exchange for things like knowledge of our own mortality? Why have we had to, through the collective, impose such strict and harsh punishment upon mankind, often very cruel punishment, in order to shape and mold people into new types of animals? For what purpose is all of this? What is it all aimed at? And Nietzsche doesn't believe that the domestication of man is an admirable thing simply in and of itself. And in fact, seems to rather more admire the naturalness of the barbarians at times, right? So no, for the domestication of man to have value at the great cost that it exacts, we have to determine what it has done for us. We have tightened a funnel around our instincts so that we are now narrowly confined by laws, social norms, by morality. What are we being funneled towards? It's the direction that matters, because life is an ever-transforming thing. It's not a fixed and static thing. The answer to this, therefore, cannot be longer lives, or more comfort, or more safety, or progress simply in the sense of like utilitarian technological progress. Nietzsche rejects utilitarianism, which is the common endpoint of the many pathways that you could see branching off from the Christian morality, based on pity and the search for the truth. Its forefather, the Socratic optimistic morality based on reason and the theoretical approach to life and approach to human society and problems. Nietzsche doesn't believe that mankind is necessarily advancing, and believes that every increase that we have in our comfort represents a danger to us. That progress, so to speak, the advancement of new technologies, scientific, social, and political, which make our lives easier and safer, contain within them the very thing that will eventually weaken us. After the decline of religion and all mystical or superstitious beliefs or any revelatory ways of knowing, mankind's values began to secularize, and what seems to have value seems to simply be, in the wake of this, self-preservation. If our lives didn't have any value before, merely by preserving them, we certainly do not add any. And since our individual lives ultimately cannot be preserved, the whole thing is sort of folly. Thus, in practice, what happens in a utilitarian society is that we make ourselves so comfortable that we're miserable, and then try to distract ourselves from the meaninglessness of our own deaths by simply following what is most pleasurable and attempt to extend our mortal existence for as long as we possibly can. The human animal in the process of this becomes less able to survive independently, and here we do not even mean as atomized individuals, but even on the level of small groups or families. In modernity, we're all plugged into a grid. We have water flowing from a tap into our homes, to the point where without these incredible luxuries, from the perspective of a hunter-gatherer looking in at peeking in our society, they would think, wow, you're all very, you're so dependent on these things that you would be quite helpless without them, right? And thus, in the grand scheme of things, it's difficult to say that we actually are better off than we were as roving bands of hunter-gatherers prior to the attainment of conscious self-reflection, right? We're more comfortable, and yet our existence is consumed in this war with ennui. We are in many ways more entertained. We have more opportunities to find what we call fulfillment in things, far outside of quotidian survival. And yet it's difficult to say that we are, on the balance, happier. 70% of American adults are on some kind of mood-altering medication, right? So there is, in a secularized utilitarian world, little reason to care about that much beyond oneself, and certainly not beyond one's own generation. Technological progress, of course, marches on because we're, like all living beings, we're striving for more and more power. And this course has proven able to get it for us. But none of it ever means anything unless we can say what the goal is, what the end is. And under an ethical system where every individual life is sacred and must be preserved, where we no longer believe in gods or afterlives and thus care supremely about living as long as possible, and where all the values are in the final analysis based on me, how can we see fit to sacrifice for anything or sacrifice our lives for the greater good? And if no one has this capacity any longer, is it even possible to posit such an aim as, or such a goal for human society that of the type that Nietzsche is looking for, right? And so ironically, while many charge that Nietzsche's moral political framework is inhuman or would be oppressive to the majority, it's just worth noting where we find as the likely endpoint of utilitarian society, which would be in theory the most beneficial to the majority, since it's literally based on that principle. What we find is, rather than a utopia where everyone's happy, an increasingly bleak existence ruled by addiction and depression. And that shouldn't surprise us. As Nietzsche writes in a tentative note meant to be included in the abandoned work Will to Power, quote, "Not for pleasure does man strive, but for power," end quote. And thus the situation is simply this: that as society strives forward, it acquires more power to control the environment. Everyone in it increasingly has more access to this control, more access to new technology and new wealth. But what the average person does with this power is to indulge in pleasure, which ultimately does not lead to fulfillment. And the more our social progress eliminates the opportunities for us to use or express our power to overcome challenges or solve problems, increasingly the only thing for us to do is to seek after pleasure. And so from the utilitarian perspective, that should be bringing us closer to the ideal, right? Because the time that you're not spent doing the things that give you pleasure, right, make you happy or fulfilled, are times when you're struggling, isn't that a form of suffering? Isn't that something that is less than ideal, less than what your life could be if you're struggling and toiling or fighting for your survival, right? And yet, as the acquisition of power generally begins to increasingly remove us from having to pursue or express power in any meaningful way, which is always through struggle, we find indeed that what we wanted was not pleasure. And the way Nietzsche describes or defines power is the ability to strive, to expand, to absorb, to grow, to fight, to assert oneself. Nietzsche's contrasting basis for society springs from that counter-assertion, then, that the good of the entire populace, in the utilitarian sense, cannot be trusted as a basis for society. That the average person will not, when given the option, pursue their own good in the long run, but increasingly give in to short-term pleasures, the more these are available to them. Rather than withholding gratification or sacrificing for some higher duty, people will eschew the entire basis of command and obedience and declare that, every man is a king, as we believe ourselves to be now. And once you get rid of that framework of command and obedience, in Nietzsche's view, you've gotten rid of something that's absolutely necessary for culture or society to exist at all. Nietzsche writes in Twilight of Idols, quote, "For what is freedom? That one has the will to self-responsibility," end quote. His picture of a noble person always includes this idea of somebody who has the ability to obey out of their own willpower. Someone so constituted as to recognize which of the virtues within themselves, are the highest, and obey them out of their own force of will. The difference between this person and the so-called common person is that, in Nietzsche's view, borrowing from the viewpoint of the Greek aristocrats, the average person does not possess this ability. And most people have to be made to obey. And if they're going to live virtuously, they'll have to be made to live virtuously by use of force. So we might consider here Nietzsche's philological study of the Greeks and the aristocratic view that only the nobility were truthful. This is in Beyond Good and Evil, section 260. He says, quote, "The fundamental belief of all aristocrats is that the base-born people are liars. We, the truthful, this is what the aristocrats of ancient Greece called themselves," end quote. So Nietzsche asserts here that the Greek aristocrats took it for granted that the common people were untrustworthy, changeable, cowardly. And This is because their understanding of being a liar is that it's being untrue to your words, whether this involves intentionally deceiving someone or making an oath that you don't have the courage to obey when the time comes. This is also discussed in Genealogy of Morality, Section 5. So, in essence, virtue is not distributed evenly across the population. It's a rare thing to find people who will hold to an oath they've taken, even if it means, giving up their life in order to do so, to hold to their word. In practice, the only way to enforce such oaths was to hold the pain of death over people's heads for breaking them. So this is a view of government somewhat in line with classical conservative ideas, right? That's the classical conservative view of government in the broad sense, is that people are not inherently good. That would be the moralistic way to put it. Or, maybe to put it more neutrally, that people are not inherently of any special quality, right? That in order for people to have any value, they have to be forced into patterns of behavior that are good for them, that the government should be tutelary, that the people basically have to be educated into how to behave in ways that are beneficial to society and to themselves. Because unlike the aristocracies of old, they don't have the ability to obey their own will. This is actually, classical conservatism in that sense might be a little different from Nietzsche's radical aristocratism, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the important thing is that Nietzsche calls for this sort of rank ordering of individuals in society. This concept is often referred to as the order of rank. In the most basic sense, it's just the view that hierarchy is a necessary fact of the human social life, because in all life, Nietzsche finds the will to power. And as we've discussed on the podcast before, he sees commanding and obeying in all these manifestations of will to power. This is in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Zarathustra says, "He who cannot obey shall be commanded," and that commanding is harder than obeying. Aristocracy, if we break down the word, means rule by the best. And so the simplest formulation of Nietzsche's doctrine is therefore, we should allow rulership only by those who can obey themselves. Those who cannot have to be ruled. The alternative is to, if you accept that idea, that most people can't obey themselves, the alternative then is to flirt with the destruction of your entire social order. Because their danger would then be obvious in letting people who can't control themselves take the reins of command. Now, of course, various people throughout society possess the ability to suspend short-term advantage and pursue some higher goal. That's a more lengthy way of just saying of obeying yourself, so to speak. And people possess these qualities in greater or lesser quantity and in different manifestations. All great artists, for example, have this virtue in some aspect. All artists have to subject themselves to hard work at their technique, which involves the sacrifice of long hours and the commitment to a vision that you wish to impose on reality, often in exchange for no immediate benefit, financial or social. And so that's a form of self-legislation, you might say, or self-command. And so in Nietzsche's view, it's not just a society starkly divided between nobles and common, but there's sort of, I would say in his broader work, you can see this recognition that there is a spectrum of degrees to which people can obey themselves, you might say, and an intermediate sort of class of people might be like artists and scholars, right? We could consider this passage from Nietzsche's Fragments. You can find this in KSA 13:14. Quote, "The same discipline makes both the soldier and the scholar hardworking. And seen more closely, there is no hardworking scholar who does not have the instincts of a hardworking soldier in his body. What does one learn in a hard school? Obeying and commanding." End quote. And so he correlates it with higher education there. Nietzsche, in fact, believes that even consciousness itself, the intellect, it's only useful as a net of communication between human beings, as we've discussed in an episode last season. It's a means of the collective gaining power to organize itself. But how? It organizes itself by creating the possibility for the issuance of commands. That's what he writes in that passage, The Genius of the Species, that the earliest human collective units which were able to gain power over other human groups, they were hierarchical. I mean, the first were essentially military structures. A military structure is organized. It's an example of cooperation and of collective power, but they're not run like democracies. They're not premised on the idea that everyone in a military, that all of their lives are sacred and must be preserved. It's quite the opposite premise, that the life of those higher up in the hierarchy is actually worth more, and that the people in the lower ranks' lives are worth less and less the lower you go, such that they're obliged to sacrifice themselves for the protection of their superiors. So the entire functioning of the military is based on the chain of command structure, and if you use that as an analogy and consider why it wouldn't work if the hierarchy was abolished, then you have the entire basis for Nietzsche's belief in commanding and obedience as this mark of virtue, that when in any organizational structure that we actually want to succeed, it has this hierarchical aspect to it. And indeed, what quality one requires in a general is just this ability for him to command himself, to keep cool in the heat of battle, to not make rash decisions, to be prudent and sober, to be disciplined even with no immediate superior around to force him to be. If you eliminate all of that, the structure collapses and becomes totally ineffective at competing with other power structures. And so apply that idea to society itself, not just the military, and we have most of the aspects of Nietzsche's political argument concerning command and obedience. Part of Nietzsche's cultural critique of contemporary Germany, which we discussed in his Untimely Meditations essays, concerns this point: how the education system of his time seemingly ran counter to instilling those virtues that are needed for thriving in a world which is rank-ordered. He writes in a fragment found in KSA 1, 750, quote, "All cultural education, Bildung, begins with the opposite of what is now celebrated as academic freedom. It begins with obedience, subordination, discipline, and serfdom. And just as a great leader needs followers, also these need a leader to guide them," end quote. It's funny because we just always, what we gravitate towards first with Nietzsche is his ideas of the free spirit and of freedom from all of these old sort of value structures, right? That's often what people first find in Nietzsche. But there's a sort of, dialectical counterbalance to that found throughout his work, that actually the way you find freedom or become a free spirit is through first learning the rules, right? It's to use an example in music, like jazz music. I remember a jazz teacher told me when, somebody complained, hey, if this is all about improvisation and going outside of music theory, why are we spending so much time learning to read sheet music and learning music theory? And the teacher said, you have to learn the rules before you can break them, right? So I think that's an aspect of it here. Now, when we apply this to politics, not just education, it's very easy to get uncomfortable because this would invariably involve the sacrifice of some of our freedoms. And so to disappoint the individualist readings of Nietzsche in a political sense, Nietzsche writes, in one of his unpublished fragments, this is in KSA 12-280, quote, "My philosophy is directed at order of rank, not at an individualist morality," end quote. So the extent to which he's willing to go in arguing for this, we can see in Beyond Good and Evil 257, where Nietzsche takes us through to the necessary conclusions of this belief, which we've already sort of hinted at, or rather it was suggested with the passage that we began the episode with, that this social arrangement means that some people will be made into objects in order to create the situation in which others can be creative self-legislators, right? That this social arrangement depends on slavery. And so Nietzsche writes, quote, "Every elevation of the type man has hitherto been the work of an aristocratic society, and so it will always be. A society believing in a long scale of gradations of rank and differences of worth among human beings, and requiring slavery in some form or another. Without the pathos of distance, such as grows out of the incarnated difference of classes, out of the constant outlooking and downlooking of the ruling caste on subordinates and instruments, and out of their equally constant practice of obeying and commanding, of keeping down and keeping at a distance, That other, more mysterious pathos could never have arisen, the longing for an ever-new widening of distance within the soul itself, the formation of ever higher, rarer, further, more extended, more comprehensive states. In short, just the elevation of the type man, the continued self-surmounting of man, to use a moral formula in a supermoral sense, end quote. And so we have in this passage a few aspects I want to elaborate on. The first is the pathos of distance. An appeal to pathos in the common parlance is an appeal to emotion. To bring pathos to something is to bring emotional depth, right? The Greek word pathos has many meanings. It can mean passion. It can also mean an event, or it can indicate suffering. It can indicate destiny or fate. Wherever Nietzsche uses the word or the term pathos of distance, he's referring to the social and physical distance he feels should be kept between higher and lower people, that the separation between different ranks of human beings should be real and felt, that this should be a weighty emotional reality, and that one's rank position is a sort of fate that we must accept, even if it entails suffering. Nietzsche invokes this concept in other places in his work, but interestingly, in one of his unpublished notes in Will to Power, you can find this number 635, he even describes will to power itself in terms of pathos, writing, quote, "The will to neither a being nor a becoming, but a pathos. It is the most fundamental fact from which becoming and affecting result." End quote. Interestingly enough, this note, in context, it refers to Nietzsche's work in exploring sort of physics on the basis of will to power and force point theory. We talked about all that last season as well. That would take us a little too far from the topic at hand, but I bring it up here because I think the sense in which he is using pathos here applies to the pathos of distance. For Nietzsche, the dictum that all men are created equal is explicitly rejected. Zarathustra declares, on the contrary, that men are not equal. The essential character of life is inequality and indifference, immorality, the various things of the world striving against one another, either ascending or descending, either meeting and overcoming opposing wills or giving in to them. There's no other option than those two, and so the order of rank, therefore, flows out of this pathos of distance, this felt necessity of the destiny of the essential differences between individuals in terms of their value, and the felt necessity to preserve, therefore, these distinctions. So an argument that hierarchy is, in fact, so fundamental to life that it is, it's like an a priori fact to Nietzsche. Some other aspects in that passage from Beyond Good and Evil, his assessment that this order of rank and this pathos of distance is in fact what has advanced mankind by opening the possibility for such a rank ordering of our internal world as well, and the yearning for vaster distances to be attained in that world, because that means more powerful distinctions or differentiations, which is sort of the very basis of concept formation. So the creation of the image, the practice of all arts and sciences, and all personal virtue, it's all based on individuation, that is, excluding which is that which does not fit in a given category and making the categories as refined as possible for greater precision in thought. That's the basis of all knowledge and all virtue. And so in a sense, he's attributing the order of rank and the pathos of distance as the forces which gave rise to the very possibility of, say, the Socratic approach to life, of know thyself and all things in moderation. It's just that this Socratic approach based on reason then goes in and knocks down the order of rank and the pathos of distance for being irrational. And so they are. But this is, of course, Nietzsche's very familiar critique of the problem of science, that, of course, logic rests on a foundation of illogic. And so Nietzsche's assessment is that this is an extramoral project, that he is engaged in. He believes, in fact, that morality as we usually discuss it today, particularly morality as understood in universalist terms, which makes all people equal as a first principle, that only arises as the aristocracy is in decline. So the thinking in terms of these essentially different categories in the external world cultivates our our rational mind to the point where we can then turn our power for critique on our own society. And then once that society in that its current form is exhausted and sort of winding down, all of those cultural values on which it was based can be knocked down by the intellect, right? And so tied in with his critique of moralism is his support of this self-legislating pre-morality, as we might call it, but where he also says it's sort of that simultaneously he's looking back and looking forward, right? That it's pre-moral and post-moral. It's extra-moral. And that is the attitude, as he sees it, of the aristocracy. A morality which did not have to rationally explain itself, which he believes that sort of morality preceded the current one, and that, in some sense, the sublation of the current morality will lead us to this extra-moral place once again. This is part of Nietzsche's problem with Socrates. Socrates, of course, brings forth the dialectic as his chief philosophical tool for attacking the Greek culture, attacking its prejudices and its illusions. That's why Nietzsche's charge against Socrates, that he's a plebeian, he's a common person, that he's ugly. It's not simply a rude remark, but it's the basis of a political criticism of Socratism, that the dialectic is necessarily a product of the commoners, that it is a tool of the mind that is steeped in the material conditions of being a common person, of being of common base-born origin, right? Because it is necessarily universalist, based on the idea that all men, regardless of rank, are subject to the dictates of reason, and therefore can be interrogated as such. Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil 191, quote, Socrates, of course, had initially sided with reason, given the taste of his talent, that of a superior dialectician, and in point of fact, didn't he spend his whole life laughing at the shortcomings of his clumsy noble Athenians, who, like all noble people, were men of instinct, and could never really account for why they acted the way they did, end quote. So we once again find the opposition of instinct to reason here, or instinct is prior to reason, rather, and that these are people who are more in touch with their own instincts, the nobility, because they require less constraint on their actions and they're able to obey themselves. They are less pathological people than the masses. And furthermore, the dialectic is sort of an insult to the entire framework of rank ordering of society. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche writes in Problem of Socrates, Part 5, quote, people were generally distrustful of reasons being displayed like this. Nothing with real value needs to be proved first. Where authority is still part of the social fabric, wherever people give commands rather than reasons, the dialectician is a type of clown. He is laughed at and not taken seriously. Socrates was a clown who made himself be taken seriously, end quote. Very damning critique of Socrates when you think about it. And so it's in the Socratism of morality, optimism, the theoretic worldview, we find the first incarnation of the slave revolt in morality, the overthrow of the socially stratified order, at least in a value sense, right? This socially stratified order, Nietzsche finds indispensable for life itself. And so this carries on into Nietzsche's problem with Christianity, which, he calls Platonism for the people. And then we can also see this problematic element in Kant, problematic to Nietzsche. What these worldviews, Platonism, Christianity, and Kantianism all share in common is their universalism. Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, Part 5, of how Kant lured us down dialectical bypaths, and via the same road of dialectic on which Socrates traveled in his project to attack the instincts and supplant them with reason, right? Kant also arrives at the same end, which is universalism. Reason is universal and binding on all men for Socrates. By the time of Kant, all human beings are proclaimed to be ends unto themselves, right? And it's immoral to treat anyone else as a mere means. And we therefore see the dialectic, the attack on instinct, on perspective, and on difference. And insofar as life itself for Nietzsche involves predation and injury and exploitation, and thus treating other beings as mere means, this makes morality in all of these three forms, which you could say are three of the most influential forms on the Western mind, so that makes morality anti-life. Again, to maybe a callback to the first episode, I remember I looked up the Wikipedia on just philosophy, and the three pictures for Western philosophy are Plato, Kant, and Nietzsche, right? And then you look at the influence of Christianity. It's huge, probably bigger than any of those three philosophers. And so you can really see how the moral fabric for most of the West's existence, you can see the common thread throughout them, all three iterations we just talked about, and we can see why Nietzsche considers them to be quote-unquote anti-life. So in Twilight of Idols, this is section 5, part 4, Nietzsche writes, quote, "I formulate a principle. All naturalism in morality, that is, all healthy morality, is dominated by an instinct of life. Anti-natural morality turns, on the contrary, precisely against the instincts of life." End quote. And so I think that's helpful for understanding the reasons why Nietzsche sometimes speaks of himself in contradictory terms. You know, he wavers between calling himself an immoralist or destroyer of morality, or he calls Zarathustra the annihilator of morality, and so on, versus showing his approval for the master morality, or as an attempt to create a meta-ethical principle based on will to power. In the book Daybreak, where Nietzsche says he first began his attack on morality, he nevertheless, in that book, expresses an approval for what he called the antique morale, the whole morality of antiquity. His attack on morality is an attack on the universalist codes of morality, those sort of more the post-theoretical Western forms of morality crafted by reason as a means of condemning or attacking life. The kind of morality that Nietzsche would wish to instill, in contrast, might be recognized as morality only in the sense that Zarathustra speaks of it as a form of self-overcoming, which in some sense, it's like distilling morality down to its essence, right? And so perhaps through some new reevaluated morality, there could arise a new aristocracy of free spirits who would be suitable to take command of society. Discipline is central in this because power in the social sense means the power of command and obedience, as we've talked about. In Beyond Good and Evil 2:10, Nietzsche writes that the aristocrat requires, quote, critical discipline and every habit conducive to cleanliness and severity in the things of the spirit, end quote. In another fragment, Nietzsche writes of his ideal of, quote, an aristocracy of peers who are used to ruling jointly and understand how to command, end quote. There's a really interesting description elsewhere in Daybreak where he sort of describes the type of character he would look for. It's notable. So what I find interesting about this, the description he gives is not of like ideologically what someone would look like, or, what ideas or principles they would hold, but in some sense their physical composure, their comport, it's like the Nietzschean image of what a virtuous and gentlemanly person looks like. So this is Daybreak 201, quote, people of aristocratic habits, men or women, never sink worn out into a chair. When everyone else makes himself comfortable, as in a train, for example, they avoid reclining at their ease. They do not appear to get tired after standing at court for hours at a stretch. They do not furnish their houses in a comfortable manner, but in such a way as to produce the impression of something grand and imposing, as if they had to serve as a residence for greater and taller beings. They reply to a provoking speech with dignity and clearness of mind, and not as if scandalized, crushed, shamed, or out of breath in the plebeian fashion. As the aristocrat is able to preserve the appearance of being possessed of a superior physical force which never leaves him, he likewise wishes by his aspect of constant serenity and civility of disposition, even in the most trying circumstances, to convey the impression that his mind and soul are equal to all dangers and surprises." End quote. And so I think what we see in where Nietzsche's emphasis is in one's habits, or in one's, overall general bearing, this aristocratic bearing that he describes. It's an image of someone that's always under control of their own instincts, and someone who, he writes elsewhere, breathes power and displays it through their every movement and posture. So that's the kind of presentation of yourself or way of carrying yourself that is shaped by your instincts and your habits and like who you are as a person in physical space and in the world. That's what he describes. It's again the difference in how Nietzsche wants to frame the world versus the morality in the narrow sense, right? Renato Christi, in his essay that precedes the translation he does of Nietzsche's work on Theognis of Megara, which we're going to look at later in the season. But Christie notes that his advice here is not dissimilar to that given by Theognis to young Cyrnus, his Theognis being the sort of mentor to Cyrnus, or to the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, a book which is dedicated to his son Nicomachus. And thus, to recapitulate briefly, the value of society, in Nietzsche's view, it's not constituted by the entire populace. It's these great people who provide the justification for civilization. It's only within the bounds of civilization that such an extraordinarily individual character could emerge and provide a new and extraordinary example of a life. And just as millions of the species reproduce themselves and the genes that are passed on are mostly the same, it's the mutations in the small number of individuals that allows the species as a whole to continue transforming. Mutation is the exception, right? But that's what drives the process of evolution. And so it's the exception that drives humanity forward. Consider, to use a biological metaphor again, the few individuals among a subspecies of white moths who are born gray or black instead of white. That's a mutation, an exception to the norm. And then when the Industrial Revolution comes along and begins pumping ash and soot into the air, the black moths are suddenly more adaptable to this new situation, and they survive in greater numbers. Now the species changes in order to overcome this new challenge. And it changes in the image of those first exceptions, who found themselves fitter than all the others. For Nietzsche, all life is like that. The exception is the driving force. That's what's pushing us into the future. So Nietzsche writes in another passage in 1887, an unpublished passage, quote, "A culture of exception, of experimentation, danger, and nuance leads to a wealth of forces. That is the aim of every aristocratic culture. Only when a culture has at its disposal excessive force may it, exactly for this reason, generate a culture of luxury." End quote. So it's the exceptional people, the ones who are willing to face danger, the people willing to do things like, say, storm Normandy Beach, that can create a society powerful enough to live in luxury. But with luxury comes the danger that those who cannot obey themselves are going to give in to pleasure-seeking. And so Nietzsche sees, at least historically speaking, luxuria as created by the warrior aristocrat and then the polity weakened when luxury affects it and it ceases to be solely the right of the aristocrat, when people who are not in any way exceptional accrue wealth and power to themselves. The exception is what transforms culture, and thus the culture is produced by the sum total of its exceptions. We look through the history of the arts, the great cultural productions come to us from individual great minds. It's from geniuses that we find the works of genius, right? And just as we don't find virtue in even measure among everyone, neither is genius equitably, distributed throughout the population. We find instead that most people are unextraordinary. Obviously, that means if they're unextraordinary, they're ordinary. You just cancel out the double negative. And all the scientific innovations come from hyper-intelligent people who are, as we say, gifted, which is a revealing turn of phrase. They've been given a gift that it's not a matter of our like free will, or whether they were moral enough in their decision making, or virtuous or hardworking enough. Even if people don't put it in terms that we would classify as like moral in the narrowest sense today, like between good and evil, right? When people, especially on say the right wing, talk about hard work, there is a moralistic element that that in some sense the amount of wealth that people have, even though there are, of course there's exceptions and there's luck into it, but mostly people's wealth reflects like how much they deserve based on how hard they were willing to work. And yes, discipline and hard work plays into this. And yet we find that the extremes of who is disciplined and hardworking are dominated by a very small number of people at the fringes, right? Just when we look at pretty much any domain of activity. I mean, obviously Jordan Peterson popularized this with the Pareto distribution, so it's almost like old hat to bring it up at this point. But it's always the rare and extraordinary people, right? And this even applies to how industrious you are, how able you are to suspend your short-term pleasures and put your nose to the grindstone. Doesn't appear to be something that people chose. That's a matter of their temperament, right? And so Nietzsche sees the desire to level the rank ordering in society as leading to the smothering of the great individuals. That the more utilitarian we become, the more universalist we become, the more we distribute the privileges throughout society, as well as the duties, right? Which, when you distribute duties throughout society, you're sort of trying to equalize the amount that we have to labor and become a means to an end, right? And so the end in the utilitarian moral system being the greatest good for the greatest number, that is inimical to the fostering of great individuals, just almost as a first principle, right? And so we have this passage from Beyond Good and Evil, Part 3. This is aphorism 62, a condemnation of Christianity as a moral system, which Nietzsche, again, asserts flows into modern utilitarian sentiments. Quote, "Among human beings, as among all other animal species, there is an excess of failures, invalids, degenerates, infirm individuals, those who necessarily suffer. Successful examples are always the exception among human beings as well, and given that the human being is the as yet undetermined animal, the rare exception. But even worse, the higher the type of human being which a particular person represents, the more improbable it becomes that he will turn out well. The contingent, the law of absurdity in the collective household of humanity, reveals itself in the most frightening manner in the destructive effects on the higher people, whose conditions of life are refined, multifaceted, and hard to estimate." End quote. Further down in the passage, he says that the great religions, particularly Christianity, which is the focus of this whole section, quote, "seek to preserve, to maintain alive, anything which merely allows itself to be preserved. In fact, they basically side with these unsuccessful cases as religions for those who are suffering. They agree with all those who suffer from life as from some illness, and they would like to see to it that every other feeling of life was judged false and became impossible." End quote. So, once again, we see a formulation of Nietzsche's critique of pity there, that it really is an all-totalizing feeling that wishes to invalidate every other, joy of life, which necessarily has to sort of sever itself from the feeling of pity, right? And to the all-consuming, pitying person, that's unacceptable. For Nietzsche, there's a rather straightforward argument that we should expect to see the exception often fail, which is sort of the broader thrust of what we're talking about here, and that those specimens which wish to be preserved, the common person who thinks only of their own advantage and of saving their own skin, will probably be more likely to be overrepresented among that which survives, right, over the course of generations. The defining features of the nobility, we will see as we go on, are in Nietzsche's view just in this lacking of this faculty, this lacking of the demand for self-preservation above all else. And so it's by that means that they're capable of doing great things, but that also makes them less likely to pass their genes along in some sense, to put it in blunt biological terms. And so Nietzsche writes in his earlier work, The Gay Science, in a passage entitled Noble and Common, quote, "What distinguishes the common type is that it never loses sight of advantage, and that this thought of purpose and advantage is even stronger than the strongest instincts. Not to allow these instincts to lead one astray, to perform inexpedient acts, that is their wisdom and pride. Compared to them, the higher type is more unreasonable. For those who are noble, magnanimous, and self-sacrificial do succumb to their instincts, and when they are at their best, their reason pauses. An animal that protects its young at the risk of its life, or that during the mating period follows the female even into death, does not think of danger and death. Its reason also pauses, because the pleasure in its young, or in the female, and the fear of being deprived of this pleasure dominate it totally. The animal becomes more stupid than usual, just like those who are noble and magnanimous. They have some feelings of pleasure or displeasure that are so strong that they reduce the intellect to silence or to servitude. At that point, the heart replaces the head, and one speaks of passion." End quote. And so, in contrast to what gives advantage, which the common person will usually seek out, since that is the common manifestation of will to power, we might say, the exception is the person who dares to act unreasonably, to act against their own material or economic or social advancement, the person who is willing to risk their life out of a love for something which goes beyond moral or material concerns. The example Nietzsche uses here, it's akin to an animal dying to protect its offspring, right? That's an example we find in the Symposium of Plato. Socrates sort of cites this as the words of the high priestess of Eros, Diotima, who describes this force of Eros, the god of love, or rather the spirit of love, right, as manifesting in just this way, the beast willing to battle to the death, the weaker against the stronger, because it judges what it loves to be the higher good than its own life. Now, perhaps it's a bit ironic that I'm referring to Socrates here, and not without reason, because the Symposium was Nietzsche's favorite work in school at Schulpforta. But, to refer back to the Socratic dialectic, we must really emphasize that this type of person is completely opposed to the dialectical Socratic approach to life, because of all the things we've talked about, because such a way of life is sort of anathema to the instinctual person. The passions of the higher type of person are extraordinary in this way because they indicate a love of something which is beyond their individual life, for which they are willing to sacrifice their lives. If we want a historical example of this, we could look to the practice of Roman patricians during the days of the early Republic. Livy describes how if a Roman army was losing the battle, their patrician commander, these are the nobility, right? These are the people who live in ostentatious villas, and have like storied old names, right, that are recognized by everyone in Rome, and just obscene wealth, right? But it was their duty to lead the armies, and if they were losing the battle, the patrician commander would stand atop a spear, pray to a number of powerful gods, and devote his life as a sacrifice to their glory, and in doing so, bring down a curse on the enemy army, asking them to be devoted as well. Devoted, in the original meaning of the term, basically means to be offered as a sacrifice. And so then the commander would throw himself into the enemy lines, effectively committing suicide. Livy records the incident of one Publius Decius Mus undertaking this ritual, and the Gauls and Samnites were so shaken up by it that the outnumbered Romans managed to actually win the battle. And so that was the sort of older Roman idea of patriotism, right? Die for patria in the most glorious way. So for the majority, on the other hand, there's nothing beyond their individual life for which they will willingly sacrifice, unless, of course, forced to do so, or perhaps in past times when we had mystical and religious beliefs that impelled them to do so under the illusion of some morality which had been given a metaphysical significance, right? The simplest formula being by dying on the battlefield for the sake of one's country, one would be honored all the more as a hero after death, at the Isles of the Blessed or in Valhalla or whatever the case may be. In actual fact, much of the time, these noble exceptions, though, they don't actually transform the species. They just end up squandered. That's the usual order of things, actually. That nature loves to squander all of its treasures. And that speaks to the wealth of nature, of the glory of nature, right? That it's willing to spend and basically just squander away so many of its gems because it has so many, right? So Nietzsche talks about this ever-present tension in civilization in which the force of the herd attempts to stamp down the exception. Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil 274, quote, "It requires luck and much that is incalculable if a higher human being in whom there slumbers the solution of a problem is to act, break out, one might say, at the right time. Usually it does not happen, and in every corner of the earth there are people waiting who hardly know to what extent they are waiting, and even less that they are waiting in vain. Sometimes the awakening call, that chance event which gives permission to act, comes but too late, when the best part of youth and the strength to act has already been used up." End quote. So Nietzsche's fatalism certainly plays a role in all of this. I mean, he freely admits in his framework here for talking about great people that it's not solely by their own doing that a great person is made or emerges into history, that factors have to align just perfectly, and that there are plenty of people who possess great, admirable qualities or who are extraordinary in some way, but they're simply destroyed by random circumstances of their birth or by accidents of fate. And this is simply the high cost of the elevation of the species, that many, many, many exceptions have to be culled away before one of those exceptions transforms the whole thing. And in the meantime, that which is weaker and more fragile becomes solidified as sort of the inner character of a society. Most of the exceptions die, and meanwhile, the rule is the herd animal, which reproduces and becomes the norm. And so Nietzsche writes in Ecce Homo of how the moral revaluation of the slave revolt and morals has altered our concept of the good in accord with the herd morality. Quote, "Finally, this is what is most terrible of all. The concept of the good man signifies that one sides with all that is weak, sick, failure, suffering of itself. The principle of selection is crossed. An ideal is fabricated from the contradiction against the proud and well-turned-out human being who says yes, who is sure of the future, who guarantees the future. And now he is called evil. And all this was believed as morality." End quote. So the exceptions are the more natural people in some sense, those who follow their instincts even when it runs contrary to the universal rules of society. And so morality becomes this sort of slander of nature, right? Because the people who are using morality in this sort of anti-life sense, this condemnation of life, always become the rule, and they always become hostile to the exception. And so we can say of the noble exception that they're more natural people, they have the greatest benefit to society, then they have the greatest power to transform society, and it's always in their nature to find themselves opposed by the many, who wish to crush them down for upsetting the comfort and the safety of the many. The traditional means for doing this is a social morality, a law that's universal and binding on all men, and the exception in this morality, once it attains metaphysical significance, the exception becomes evil, right? And that's why Nietzsche plays the advocate for the higher man, for the exception, for the person who is amoral. Supposing we use morality in the conventional sense of the word, for the immoral person, right? And so he writes in the very first aphorism of the Gay Science, quote, "Even the most harmful man may really be the most useful when it comes to the preservation of the species. For he nurtures in himself or in others, through his effects, instincts without which humanity would have long become feeble or rotten. Hatred, the mischievous delight in the misfortunes of others, the lust to rob and dominate and whatever else is called evil belongs to the most amazing economy of the preservation of the species. To be sure, this economy is not afraid of high prices, of squandering, and it is, on the whole, extremely foolish. Still, it is proven that it has preserved our race so far." End quote. And to move right along to a second quotation which says much the same thing, we find an elaboration in the fourth aphorism of the gay science entitled "What Preserves the Species." Quote, "The strongest and most evil spirits have so far done the most to advance humanity. Again and again, they relumed the passions that were going to sleep. All ordered society puts the passions to sleep, and they reawakened again and again the sense of comparison, of contradiction, of the pleasure in what is new, daring, untried. They compelled men to pit opinion against opinion, model against model, usually by force of arms, by toppling boundary markers, by violating pieties, but also by means of new religions and moralities. In every teacher and every preacher of what is new, we encounter the same wickedness that makes conquerors notorious. What is new, however, is always evil." End quote. And so the extraordinary people are united by they all share in the fact that they are bringing something new, which is always seen as evil almost a priori by the collective in its desire to preserve the status quo. The extraordinary person is willing to attack the status quo and to attack the old morality, and notice that the language could apply both ideologically but also refer to a physical attack. It's not for nothing that Nietzsche speaks of the artist's violence and genealogy of morality, referring to the process of founding civilizations. And so he contrasts his viewpoint yet again with this antipodal idea of utilitarianism in the same passage from the gay science. Quote, "Nowadays, there is a profoundly erroneous moral doctrine that is celebrated especially in England. This holds that judgments of good and evil sum up experiences of what is expedient and inexpedient. One holds that what is called good preserves the species, while what is called evil harms the species. In truth, however, the evil instincts are expedient, species-preserving, and indispensable to as high a degree as the good ones. Their function is merely different." End quote. So Kaufman makes an interesting note that what Nietzsche does here is not to simple-mindedly reject utilitarianism, but to attack it for its Manichaean implications of sorting that which helps and that which harms into neat categories. Because after all, if the ends are the good of the whole species, by which all means are justified, right? When do we get to reach those ends? You know, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Well, where's the omelet, right? When do we undertake the final analysis by which we decide whether the species is better off or worse off? When do the means stop? When do the ends happen? As we mentioned about our own society, we're very much more comfortable today and much safer. But, you know, supposing the electrical grid went down, the internet went black, the police aren't answering when you dial 911, the water stops coming out of the tap. Would we find ourselves more adequate to confront this situation than our ancestors 10,000 years ago? Or would our ancestors have laughed at us and our dependency on these things and simply continued living on as they have always been living? You know, a hard subsistence lifestyle, but one which nevertheless has the effect of making them stronger rather than weaker. And, you know, these examples are strewn throughout the history of humankind to a greater and lesser degree. Was it a benefit or a calamity to produce internal combustion engines on a mass scale as a means of transportation? You know, we'll find out. Was it on the balance beneficial to humanity to do research in which we create deadlier viruses in labs in order to figure out how to cure deadly viruses in case of an outbreak of one of the deadly viruses, right? We're increasingly finding out, but it's like, when do you do that final analysis? It's an intractable problem for consequentialist morality. And what we find in human history is that developments which have good immediate effects lead to harmful outcomes and vice versa. And so when we consider something that does immense harm, like a terrible war, but that leads to an outcome which is on the balance beneficial, Maybe the war galvanizes divided groups of people into a powerful unity on the basis of fighting that war, even such that it endures after the war and completely reshapes their country, or reshapes the entire global economic order, right? Suppose the competing ideologies in the war sharpen the contrast between value systems and allow the side that's victorious to define itself as a culture and civilization, right? That would be an example of evil advancing the species in the Nietzschean view. I want to go back to a passage from Beyond Good and Evil that we talked about earlier, number 257, and read the second half of it, where Nietzsche describes how this barbaric, more natural, more passionate, and stronger nobility tends to take power over societies which have succumbed to the inevitable pattern of herd morality that he describes. So a culture is birthed, it's at first strong, it lives, it produces its great people, the sort of fruit of the culture, but the good of the greatest many always gains advantage in the end, right? Because it's precisely the common person who thinks the most of gaining advantage, who is better at preserving himself and sees how to gain advantage in numbers, and meanwhile, the rare exceptions are for the most part wasted. And so the moral law of society comes to make everything exceptional evil. The herd mentality eventually takes hold. Men live for immediate pleasure and self-preservation, and then society becomes weak and vulnerable to invasion. This cycle, while merely implicit in the description Nietzsche gives, is explained here. Quote, "To be sure, one must not resign oneself to any humanitarian illusions about the history of the origin of an aristocratic society. That is to say, of the preliminary condition for the elevation of the type man. The truth is hard. Let us acknowledge unprejudicedly how every higher civilization hitherto has originated. Men with a still natural nature, barbarians in every terrible sense of the word, men of prey, still in possession of unbroken strength of will and desire for power, threw themselves upon weaker, more moral, more peaceful races, perhaps trading or cattle-rearing communities, or upon old, mellow civilizations in which the final vital force was flickering out in brilliant fireworks of wit and depravity. At the commencement, the noble caste was always the barbarian caste. Their superiority did not consist, first of all, in their physical, but in their psychical power. They were more complete men, which at every point also implies the same, as more complete beasts." End quote. And so it's an inexorable pattern for Nietzsche. Strength is manifesting in these sort of bursts, a zenith from which one is always sort of declining. Weakness is this ever-present gnawing force. Always recurs, no matter how often it's conquered. And that leads Nietzsche to his ultimately fatalistic view of politics. Like Theognis of Megara, the great banished poet of the Megarian aristocracy, Nietzsche unabashedly declares aristocracy to be the best form of government, the type of society which produces all beauty and all culture, and yet he believes there's no way of preserving it. All things die. The political order is no different. And yet, on the other hand, it's not as if Nietzsche is neutral about this, because you can say all people die, but that doesn't mean you should say, well, death is good. Death is just the same as life. I don't even care if I die, right? That's sort of would be a silly thing. And so notice where Nietzsche has oriented things like democracy and utilitarianism. Those are sort of like a death force. Those are the entropy breaking down systems that were once vital. And so his beliefs, it pushes Nietzsche to wage a sort of cultural war against the democratizing forces, the egalitarian forces, the utilitarian forces. His attempt in his work really is to show us how destructive these forces are, and to therefore affirm the value of nobility above all else, even if we admit that it always dies off eventually. Just as Nietzsche affirms life above all else, even if life can't go on forever, that doesn't mean that one simply lays down and dies, right? So many of us might admit to seeing the logic here. Genius is obviously not evenly distributed. The exception is usually of immense value. The inevitability of the social order sort of dying away. But we might nevertheless cringe when Nietzsche forces us to look at the other side of this picture from the noble individual, So if these extraordinary individuals are the ends, then the rest of the people, the ordinary people, are simply means. And he says that society depends on slavery, on making people instruments. And in fact, if we take his ideas seriously, what is the necessary conclusion? Well, Nietzsche takes us there. This is from his unpublished fragment, The Greek State, where he writes, quote, "The misery of the workers must be increased in order to make the production of the world of art possible to a small number of Olympian men," end quote. So The Greek State, that it's an essay that was originally intended to be included as part of The Birth of Tragedy. And we'll take a little closer look at that fragment later in the season, excuse me. We just spent a great deal of time going over Birth of Tragedy with a fine-tooth comb, so its content should be very familiar if you've been following along. But for a brief recap, Nietzsche sees Greek society, and particularly Dorian society, which really, that's to say Sparta, he sees it as Apollonian. Greek culture is created from the Apollonian creative force. Apollo is the god of boundaries and individuation, and these two things are inextricable. To make something individual, you have to draw boundaries around it. Similarly, Apollo is the god of dreams, that's to say visions. He's accordingly a soothsayer, and he's patron god of the plastic arts. And so, broadly speaking, Nietzsche calls Doric civilization a permanent Apollonian encampment, which, due to its rigidness and its dividing boundary lines, was able to withstand the onset of the Dionysian religious cults. These sort of manifested as drunken, ecstatic religious rituals in which individuality is swept away and destroyed. There's hardly a more stratified society than Sparta, who ritually declared war on the Helots, a race of people who lived as laborers for the sake of the Spartan society. They ritually declared war on them every single year to, reinstate the state of war under which the oppression of the Helots was justified, right? And so Sparta was committed to aristocracy to a degree that's remarkable even compared to the other Greek states. But it's only because of these rigid lines, the differences established and demanded by the Apollonian, that Dorian society could absorb the Dionysian and, basically it just sort of like crashed off the walls of Dorian society, right? And even the rest of Greek society is still sufficiently Apollonian where they can sort of like harness the Dionysian art force energy and use it to invigorate their society rather than destroy them. The greatness of the Apollonian is revealed in this ability to transform that destructive energy of Dionysus, right? Whose orgiastic rituals, they completely, according to Nietzsche, they leveled and destroyed some other societies, like Sakeia, right? In Greece, they sort of contain it within the magic circle of Attic tragedy. Here, we might draw our attention to certain aspects of Apollo, which have implicit meaning for Nietzsche. Apollo is the god who aims his bow and shoots from a distance, the god of contemplation. He keeps the image of his contemplation at arm's length, right? Rather than being absorbed by the art force, like in the Dionysian, in Apollo, you maintain your self-identity. In many respects, Nietzsche sees in the Apollonian art force the spirit of the contemplative, disciplined, noble, aristocratic mind. But there is an aspect of that in the Apollo is the image of the god that represents this pathos of distance, right? Of keeping things at a distance, aiming his bow, shooting from a distance. There's a very radical passage from the notebooks found in KSA 12:9, quote, "Main point of view, that one not consider the task of the superior species as a guide for that of the inferior, but that the inferior species serve as a basis on which the superior one rest, in order to dedicate itself to its proper task, on which it may elevate itself," end quote. And so the difference I referenced earlier between sort of classical conservatism and what the view Nietzsche is putting forward is that the Olympian men sit above the society at large, which exists for the sake of these Olympian men. It's not a tutelary government. In Nietzsche's more radical utterances, it can't be called that because such an aristocracy instructs and commands the lower classes not for the sake of the people, but for its own sake, for the sake of the nobility. Within this aristocratic Olympus, separated from the rest of society, elevated above it, and supported by the exploitation of it, In that realm, art can give rise to its greatest treasures. It's in that separate, higher, noble sphere of life in which all the value of human life is created. That's where the Sipo Matador unfolds its crown. And so even if we grant that great talents and minds could come from the lower classes, isn't that the very tragedy of being lower class, the fact that they cannot fulfill their talents? When people lament the lost Rembrandts or lost Mozarts that might exist within the proletariat, who will never realize their full potential because of how they're exploited. It's funny because the implicit idea beneath that is that you wish that all those Mozarts and Isaac Newtons and Rembrandts of the world would be lifted out of exploitation and want, such that they would no longer have to labor in order to feed themselves, but could manifest their gifts, right? Their intellectual gifts, their artistic gifts, their scientific gifts. In short, when you say that, you're saying you would like those people to be part of an aristocracy, at least to the extent that you think they should be supported by the labor of others. Because ultimately, someone has to grow and harvest the food that that person is going to eat and manufacture the clothes they wear, and so on and so forth. So, for the sake that they can just solely focus on using their minds. And Nietzsche sees in the Greeks the idea that labor was not a source of dignity, but of shame. Even in our own instincts today, to the extent that we don't think that somebody with the talent of Mozart should waste his life picking vegetables, we tacitly agree with this sentiment as well. That even if, funnily enough, the capitalists and the communists should both agree on this point, that there's a dignity to labor, we're able to see that a human being removed from this obligation to work and labor can flourish in ways that are only possible when that burden is lifted. And that if, therefore, we want to have a society that produces Mozarts and Isaac Newtons and Goethes, we have to create a situation where some people labor for the benefit of others, where some people become objects. And so, importantly, Nietzsche's not simply arguing for this state of affairs because he wants it to be the case, but because he believes descriptively that this is the case and has been the case with every society on earth. They're all based on the labor of people who have been made into means. That this is what life is, whether we like it or not. And when we try to dismantle that reality, we don't actually create a society free from it. We just dismantle society, right? And we find ourselves standing in the ruins. And that this is also true of our own society, even as it's based on these ideas of equality and individual freedom. And that therefore, we don't want to look at this ugly foundation for our society because it defies all our values. We do not want to admit that the beauty and knowledge and accomplishments of our culture are the fruits of slavery, and that if people in sweatshops weren't churning out cheap consumer goods to keep our economy afloat, there'd be a lot less people able to earn a living as a scholar or a journalist or a lawyer or any number of other jobs that can only exist when a number of complex social institutions exist and all the basic needs are met by, labor of others. And, so our society only continues to exist at all from the slavery that is imposed on the many at the behest of the few. And that if we imagine the complete undoing of this slavery, you would find an economic collapse. That would be the immediate effect, right? If the people picking all the crops decide to all go on strike at once, or to take up arms and demand their rights, what you would get is a collapse of the food system. And there's no faster route to bella omne contra omnes, right? The war of all against all. There's no faster route than that suddenly there's no food. And regardless of what anyone says, the vast majority does not want that, right? Which is why, in spite of our pretensions to our egalitarian values, our political and economic systems still make people into objects and always will. As we head towards the conclusion of this episode, I'm sure there are many of you listening that might find this highly depressing, because when we consider what Nietzsche's philosophy may indicate when imported into the political realm, this aristocratic radicalism, as Brand has described it, is exactly what we find, and it's almost impossible to impose, say, a Marxist interpretation on Nietzsche, just as much as a libertarian or individualist one. And so you have this sinking feeling in our stomach that Nietzsche's ideas are akin to the worst and most dangerous political ideas ever employed in human history. And so I'll leave you with a few final considerations that might perhaps cure your unease. First, that the authoritarian movements of the 20th century are not the norm when we consider what Nietzsche is describing, but are themselves aberrations in comparison to the long, long history of aristocracy and rank-ordered society that existed for tens of thousands of years, maybe longer. And in fact, movements such as fascism attained their horrors through what? Through the power of the hysteria of mass democratic energy, through the power of industrial society and technology, through the managerial bureaucracies that saw fit to administrate over everyone's lives, and which in no wise resembles Nietzsche's ideal social order. In fact, Nietzsche's love of aristocracy contrasts rather strangely with his distrust of, and in fact, contempt for the state. Why? Well, because the state is a means, and as such should not become the ends, should not become the receptacle of human value. In Nietzsche's time, he witnessed the initial stirrings of the ideology, everything for the state. Right? The beginnings of the worship of the state is a sort of mystery cult of political power, in which power is disembodied from the individuals within the state, which is a mistake for Nietzsche. The state is made into a sort of deity. And so he witnessed on the other side of that coin the socialistic and democratic drive to empower the state, but as a means of achieving justice or fighting authoritarianism, perceiving that only the state can be used to attain these ends, right? So the state in this model becomes the savior. Nietzsche perceives, therefore, how in the years to come the rapid increase of the power of the state will be used to transform society, and in such a way to destroy whatever dying vestiges of the old pagan religious feeling or the aristocratic ethos remained in Europe. And so we may contextualize much of his sentiments here as an attempt to preserve that which Nietzsche felt was the last bulwark against the resistless force of democracy and the eventual rise of the new idol of the state, which he rightly perceived would become the coldest of all monsters. And furthermore, this view of the state, seeing the system as a thing in and of itself, outside and above the people who live under it. I mean, that's quite literally the idea of a republic, right? The idea that we're ruled by laws and not men. And so, consequently, you have this obsession with finding the ideal system, this ideal system of laws to rule us all. It all makes the fundamental mistake that we are always ruled by men, and it makes the mistake of ignoring that. The system is just contained in the ideas within our heads, and the reality is the power relationship, the use of power, how it's manifest and felt in society. And since the rule of law is an illusion and the rule of men is always the reality, the question concerning us is, in fact, not such a radical question for Nietzsche to ask. It's the same question of all political philosophy since the Greeks. Who should rule? And I don't want to soften Nietzsche too much because his ideas of who should rule include people like Caesar, Napoleon, Friedrich II, Cesare Borgia. His criteria for rulers is not exactly straightforward, but must be gathered from remarks throughout his corpus and in the various portraits he gives of such higher people, which we will discuss in future episodes. I mean, suffice to say, what would you say? These are oftentimes conquerors, right? Or they're amoral people. They are people that are often portrayed in popular culture as the villains. And, of course they would be, because it's the wicked men who are the ones who push the species forward as much as anyone else. And the exceptional people will always be called evil, right? So this is the very, interesting and dangerous aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy that he indicates to us, is that often the best people have been vilified. And aristocracy means rule by the best. That's the literal meaning of the phrase, and that's the only system Nietzsche approves of. The people at the top of the hierarchy must truly be the best. You could say that's unrealistic, that's an idealized version of aristocracy, that in reality dynastic interests and inbreeding and that these things like made the aristocracy not of high quality, and that wealth softened them as much as it did everyone else. Now, of course, the countercharge could also be made that our views of democracy and liberal institutions are themselves unrealistic. We have this idealized view of the republic, of people ruled by laws and not men, and that, as we all know in practice, democracy is dirty business. Democracy kills, it imprisons, it suppresses rights, it goes to war. And oftentimes it does so with the pretense of being on a moral crusade and with the absolute clean conscience of a self-righteous people. And so if we're going to aim for our ideal republic while admitting that it is very improbable that it could ever come into reality, just as Socrates did 2,000 years ago or more, we still haven't found the perfect government since then. And I think we ought to allow the same charity for Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche's aristocrats and his descriptions of them are the only true individuals, and they're anything but, self-dealing and craven. They're above being vindictive. And while they might be cruel for the sake of achieving their purposes, they don't possess the malicious, soul-devouring instinct for revenge of the slave moralist. That's, in Nietzsche's view, that's our projection onto people who are noble and powerful. They're instead solely concerned with a project greater than themselves, and they live in pursuit of expressing and manifesting greater power, achieving greater expressions of power, always obeying the command of the will to power and willing and able to give orders and commands to others. And they leave behind a legacy. They create something, bring unity to society, and so on and so forth. That is all an idealized view, but I suppose what I'm saying is, it's at least as idealized as a lot of our ideas of what, democracy would look like. And we all still practice it, even as it has never measured up to those ideas. And so let Nietzsche have his ideal, right? And so Zarathustra loves man as a bridge and not a goal, right? Nietzsche thinks that the aristocratic forms of government were to the good of mankind. To put it in the form of a utilitarian argument that Nietzsche would have reviled, but whatever, right? That the aristocracy or the aristocratic way of governance or of political philosophy was a bridge leading us on to higher things. And so maybe to put it in terms he might have found more agreeable, we can say that this view of what politics would be is shaped by his view of what life is, which I've kind of referenced throughout, but we find this in Beyond Good and Evil, number 259. This is the final passage we'll consider for today. Quote, "Life is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of what is alien and weaker, suppression, hardness, imposition of one's forms, incorporation, and at least at its mildest, exploitation. Exploitation does not belong to a corrupt or imperfect or primitive society. It belongs to the essence of what lives, as a basic organic function. It is a consequence of the will to power, which is, after all, the will of life." End quote. And so that's what the parasitic vine, the Sipo Matador, manifests. And who are we to say that what that vine is doing is wrong? That it is immoral because it is parasitism? Are we to say that predation is wrong? That predators should be ashamed of themselves? Well then, if we are not prepared to say that, then we cannot say so of the predatory society or the exploitative society. Because where are you going to find any value outside of that? Nietzsche's understanding of politics is a necessary consequence of his understanding of life, and his understanding of morality in the narrow sense has anti-life. And as much as we might wish for things to be different, once again, Nietzsche begins, first and foremost, with a hardened insistence that we deal with the cold, terrible reality. Okay, so we've begun by laying all the cards on the table, so no one can accuse me of being an obscurantist or of obfuscating Nietzsche's philosophy in any way, because this is the most extreme stuff. But this season will not simply elaborate on this, aristocratic political theory. I want to discuss the use of Nietzsche even for political goals he would not have shared, as I sort of brought up earlier. But we're starting here, and where we're going to go from here is we're going to go back to Greece, which I know we go back to Greece quite a bit on this podcast, but we're starting with a few voices in Greek political thought and Nietzsche's view of Greek politics, Greek political theory. We've covered those ideas in some sense in this episode, but as a sort of foundation for the season, we're going to start with Greece. In in a little bit more depth, right? But actually, next episode, if you will join me next week, we're going to go to a book that Nietzsche never read, from everything I can tell, but which I would say is indispensable for understanding ancient Greek history, and is going to give us invaluable context for all the works that Nietzsche talks about and that we will talk about as the podcast goes forward. So join me next week where we dive into Fustel de Coulanges, his monumental work, The Ancient City. Okay, everyone, it's good to be back for season 3. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.